Okay, so talking about the differences between ought to and should. Basically, I see this as a should umbrella. And so should is a very good modal to use for advice. So underneath this should umbrella, we could use ought to, and we could use had better. Now, had better is the stronger form, which is very close to must, and the ought to is more softer advice, so it's closer to should. Both of these are strong and soft versions of should. For example, you ought to practice your verbs. There's no consequence if you don't, but it's just good advice. You ought to practice your verbs. That's a good restaurant. You ought to try it. Speaking fast, it sounds more like oughta, so people say, you ought to try that restaurant. It's just soft advice, no obligation. Whereas had better is a little bit stronger. If I say, for example, I'm planning to travel to Italy next week, well, I had better make sure I have a passport. Consequences of not having a passport are pretty serious. Therefore, I must have a passport. What happens with the had better is it gets softened to a better, so you'd better have a passport. And what happens is people, when speaking, it sounds like just better. You better get a passport. Again, stronger advice on this side, softer on this side. You could use had better like should, but think of it closer to a must. The nice thing about ought to is you never really have to use it. You can always use should. So if you don't feel comfortable using it, don't. Just use should. For example, your shoes are untied. You should tie them. You ought to tie them. You don't need to use ought to. Okay, differences with have to and have got to. Both of these are used for obligation. Have got to seems to be used more, it seems, in British English. What happens with have to is it sounds almost like a have to. You don't want to write this, but this is what you hear people say. I have to go, I have to do it. It's obligation. We use this much more than must. Must is typically used for rules, laws, legislation. So you can say, classroom rules might say you must not speak another language in class. It's strict for rules. Whereas if I say you have to speak English in class, you are expected to speak English. This is very common in just spoken English. Have to, obligation, have to. The have got to can also be used. The big distinction is that have got to gets shortened to almost a gotta. So you'll often see this in text messages, casual language. I gotta go. Gotta go. It means I have got to go, which is the same meaning as I have to go. The biggest difference in terms of use is that when you're talking about have to, this easily changes in the past to had to. So for example, I have to do my homework today. Yesterday I couldn't go because I had to do my homework. They're both obligation. This easily shifts into the past. However, when I have got to, this does not work in the past tense. Therefore, as a modal, it's okay present tense, it's modal for the future, but as soon as you start talking about yesterday, it shifts to either had to. So for example, I can't go with you to the movies tonight because I have got to study. If I said, yesterday, I couldn't go to the movies because I had to study. So it has essentially the same meaning, but you can't use this in the past. Lastly, let's talk about must. As I mentioned earlier, must is typically not used interchangeably with have to, because in casual speech we use have to much more frequently, or got to. Must is typically used when we're talking about obligation for rules, written laws, things like that. You must not smoke in the public, for example. It's illegal. However, must has another use in addition to obligation. So obligation is the sort of have to, have got to. But in addition to obligation, we use it for what I call logical deduction. And what that basically means is that it's an assumption, and it's a strong assumption. So for example, if I know a student is always in class, never sick, but yesterday he was coughing, I would say, well, That student must be sick today. That's why he's not in class. Is there another possibility? Yes, but because he was coughing yesterday, it's probably a 95% chance that he's at home sick or at the doctor's, but he must be sick. Is it an obligation? You must be sick. Command. No, it's a different use, a different meaning. If I put